Now back to our main story and the general election. The warning that the fate of 100,000 North Sea jobs is riding on the outcome. That's the thrust of a new report from Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce. It suggests whichever party wins, they'll have just 100 days to restore confidence in the sector or risk losing investments worth around £30 billion. We're speaking to all of the larger parties this morning. Let's speak now to Stephen Flynn, who's the SNP's Westminster leader. Morning.
Good morning, Lucy. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, and I hope you are too. 100 days to save 100,000 jobs, according to the Chamber of Commerce. What would be the SNP's plan?
Well, this is a stark warning, is it not? And this is the thing which, as I'm sure will come as no surprise to you, your listeners, is coming up on the doors in Aberdeen on an almost hourly basis, because people are worried. They're worried about what the future holds. The 100,000 jobs figure which you're referring to there is a figure that was put forward by industry investment experts based upon the plans which have been put in place by the Labour Party. So what the Labour Party are proposing at this election is the potential loss of 100,000 energy jobs. And I hate to break it not just to the Labour Party but also to listeners, but there is no way of reaching net zero. There's no way of capitalising upon our offshore and our onshore renewables potential without these individuals, because oil and gas workers operate in a transient manner. They'll go and work in Norway or in Africa or in the Middle East or in South America if the jobs don't exist here. And if we lose them, they are the most valuable component we have in order to meet net zero. So the stakes are incredibly high, and that's why we need MPs in Westminster who won't just stand up for Aberdeen, won't just stand up for Scotland's energy industry, but will always put it first, and only the SNP will do that.
What does that actually mean in tangible terms? Put it first. Give us some ideas.
Well, it means in real terms making sure that we're arguing for a just, sustainable energy transition, one that protects the workforce that we currently have, but one that ensures that we have a transition to come. Now, if we look at the opportunities of the transition, they're enormous, but they're being held back by policy decisions in Westminster. The lack of investment in the grid, the lack of investment in the financial mechanisms to bring on stream offshore wind and the likes of green hydrogen, the lack of certainty that we've had for decades now over carbon capture and storage. But ultimately, what takes precedence over all of that is making sure that we don't have representatives from Scotland who will go to Westminster and support plans which would get rid of 100,000 jobs, because that offshore wind can't happen without those people, and it would be ruinous to the Scottish economy. So that's a very clear example of why we need SNP MPs in Westminster putting Scotland first, because Scotland's economy is, of course, hugely important to the opportunities that we can all have, both in the private sector and in the public sector.
So we're still, I reckon it's probably fair enough to say, at the start of this election campaign. I just wanted to get some things set out from you while we've got you at the start of this then. What is the SNP's position on exploration and new drilling in the North Sea?
So our position has been certainly very clear for a long time, which is that we want a just and sustainable transition, one that, as I say, protects the jobs that we have but creates those jobs of tomorrow too. And the only way that can happen is making sure that you are still in a position where you are supporting the workforce and you're supporting industry as it stands, whilst investing simultaneously in the jobs of tomorrow. Now, of course, what you're going to come on and ask me is the Scottish Government has a draft energy strategy which was out for consultation when we were, of course, in government with the Greens. That consultation referred to a presumption against. I heard Ryan Crichton from the Aberdeen Chamber of Commerce rightly raise that this morning. The Scottish Government will, of course, come forward in due course with its final energy strategy. But our position throughout all of this has been very clear, and I've been quite honest with the people of Aberdeen about my commitments to them on this.
Can I read into that then, Stephen Flynn, that if you're saying that this did say a presumption against and now there's a new energy strategy, that the new energy strategy will not have those words presumption against in it?
I'm afraid I'm not. I can do many things, but I can't speak on behalf of the Scottish Government. I'm not a Scottish Government minister.
Do you think it should?
All I was simply doing was outlining the fact that the energy strategy as it stands is not published in its final form. I'm very much looking forward to it being published in its final form. But look, I think we all need to recognise, irrespective of where you are, the importance of the oil and gas sector to Scotland's economy, and the fact that those 100,000 individuals that we're talking about are absolutely absolutely crucial in our journey to net zero. If they don't have jobs now, I'm afraid that they will not be able to create the jobs of tomorrow, because these are the most skilled people in our society. These are the people who can transform our society and our economy, and we should be doing everything to back them. I'm afraid that the Labour Party's proposals to scrap 100,000 jobs would be deeply damaging, not just to our net zero ambitions, but to Scotland's economy.
And I understand what you're saying about you can't speak for the Scottish Government, but you are a representative for that part of the world, and you are the SNP leader at Westminster. I believe you probably are having quite regular conversations with John Swinney, the SNP leader. Have you advised him? Have you asked him to put it?
I'm afraid I don't think I need to advise one of the most serious and influential politicians in Scotland's history about what needs to happen to protect our economy.
Have you had conversations with him about getting rid of that line presumption against?
Everyone knows my views in relation to this particular issue, because I'm a fervent believer in making sure that
have they fallen on deaf ears, or have they been welcomed in your opinion?
Well, we've not seen the outcome of the energy strategy yet. But look, I'm a fervent believer in reaching net zero. But in order to reach net zero, you need to make sure that you are protecting the workforce that you have, and they're using the skills and experience that they have to deliver the economy of the future that we all want to see. And if you forgive me just a second, this is in stark contrast, not just to the 100,000 jobs that are at risk from the Labour Party, but they've also walked away from their previous £28 billion commitment to net zero, and which they told us would create 50,000 jobs, and now they're saying they're going to spend £5 billion, and that's going to create even more jobs, 69,000 jobs. So that they've taken a £25 billion investment hit, and they're trying to pull the wool over the people of Scotland's eyes by telling them they're going to create the jobs, when the reality is that their proposals, as outlined by industry experts, and these are the people that we should be listening to, because as politicians, experts matter, are telling them that their plans to get rid of the incentive allowances would cut 100 or put at risk 100,000 Scottish jobs. If the public aren't outraged at that, they're not paying attention, because the impact that has upon all of our lives would be huge, and indeed the public sector.
And Stephen Flynn, we're running out of time. I wanted to make sure we get through a couple more points with you before we do, if that's okay. On a windfall tax then going into this election, what will be the SNP's position on that?
Our position on a windfall tax has not changed, that during the height of the energy shock it was necessary. We also believe that it should have been imposed upon some of the biggest businesses across the UK, which were making huge profits, wholesalers and the like, who were making enormous profits whilst the public were living during a cost of living crisis. I'm afraid that fell on deaf ears at Westminster. The Tories didn't seek to implement that. Moving forward, we need to make sure that we have a fiscal regime which meets the needs of the energy sector as it stands. I don't believe that the proposals which are on the table to extend the windfall tax in the way Labour are seeking to do, or indeed remove incentive allowances, benefits the Scottish people, because it would cost 100,000 jobs. When you get to a point of taxation where you hit a tipping point and you are costing that level of jobs and the ability to meet net zero, then I'll stand against that, because to do so would be foolish. My job and my focus is on putting Scotland first, putting Scotland's economy first, and of course putting my constituents in Aberdeen first, and the only way to do that is to oppose such proposals.
And Stephen Flynn, you said that as politicians you have to trust experts. More than 100 business leaders have come out today backing Labour, and also Benny Higgins, who's a former advisor to Nicola Sturgeon and former chair of the Scottish Government Post-COVID Recovery Group, has also said that Labour is the only credible option. Do you trust those experts? Well,
of course, those experts are referring to who can be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and we are not in the business of taking on that role. What I would say is that the UK and Westminster has a consensus when it comes to the economy, and that consensus is built upon staying out of the European Union, ending freedom of movement, not having access to our biggest trading market, and it means not investing in net zero, as I just outlined there, with Labour rolling back on its £28 billion commitment down to just £5 billion. Those are the way you grow the economy. You invest in your future, you invest in net zero technologies, you invest in making sure that you have people coming to live and work here, and you seek to grow your exports to the likes of the European Union. I'm afraid that the Labour Party's proposals are the exact same as the Conservative Party proposals on those issues. It's not good enough. It's not good enough for Scotland. It's not good enough for our future, and that's why we, of course, want to chart a different path, and that's why SNP MPs are so important, because we are the only ones who will stand up in Westminster, fight for Scotland's future, who will always put Scotland first, and that's in stark contrast to every other party.
Stephen Flynn, thanks for your time this morning. Stephen Flynn, the SNP's Westminster leader, was speaking to all of the larger parties this morning.
And Scotland's energy sector is front and centre of the general election debate this morning. It follows a report from Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce warning the decisions the next government makes in its first 100 days in office will determine the fate of 100,000 North Sea jobs, with £30 billion worth of investment hanging in the balance. We've been hearing from the main political parties throughout this morning's programme. Let's bring in the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross. Good morning to you. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Laura.
14 years of Conservative government, and the North Sea is facing lower confidence than during the 2008 crash or indeed during the pandemic.
Well, this lack of confidence comes from the policies of the SNP and Labour. It's little wonder that oil and gas firms have so little confidence in these two parties, because both are recklessly committed to turning off the taps in the North Sea. They oppose new oil and gas licences. They've both opposed the Cambo and the Rosebank fields in the North Sea. They are turning their backs on the highly skilled workers that we have in the North Sea and the North East at the moment, and who will be vital for the industry and the sectors transition to net zero and into renewable, greener
Douglas
forms
Ross,
of energy.
If it's all the SNP and Labour's fault, why are we already seeing investment sitting waiting to see what's going to happen? £30 billion of investment is hanging in the balance. They're critical of the way that the Conservative government at Westminster has dealt with oil and gas as well.
Well, I understand they are critical of all parties, but I think if you look at the report, and I've read it in detail, and I think it's an excellent report from Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce, the party that has the most support in this report is the Conservative Party, but we need to do more to appeal to people in the sector and in the industry that we will back them, and they know that the only party standing up for the North East and the North Sea oil and gas sector is the Scottish Conservatives. I mean,
and yet you yourself were outspoken. You yourself were outspoken ahead of the budget of the Chancellor's plans to extend the windfall tax.
Yes, and I'll come on to that. But they are very stark in their warning that the proposals by the Labour Party will put at risk 100,000 jobs in Scotland, and the proposals of the Labour Party are almost identical to those of the SNP. And SNP MPs...
You stole a march on the Labour Party by extending the windfall tax. It was their policy and you nicked it.
Well, as I say, that was at a time of very high oil and gas prices, and there was support even by some within the industry for a levy. Now, things have changed. And
the Chancellor extended it, though, to 2029. So, you know...
And I oppose that, Laura. You know, I will speak out when I think my party has got something wrong. I was amazed that Stephen Flynn, an SNP MP at the moment for Aberdeen South, cannot tell you this morning if the SNP Scottish Government's energy strategy will or will not include a presumption against new exploration for oil and gas, because we know that's what the draft strategy includes. And the question to every SNP candidate in the North East and in other seats across the country, where it's a straight choice between the Scottish Conservatives and the SNP, will be very simple. Do they support granting new oil and gas licences for the North Sea? And
is that all you think it's going to take? Is that all you think it's going to... Sorry, I think there's a bit of a delay on the line. Is that all you think it's going to take to turn on the investment taps in the North Sea?
Well, no, there's an awful lot of things that can do that. First of all, it was the UK government that introduced a licensing bill for annual rounds of oil and gas developments in the North Sea. That was not supported by the Labour Party or the SNP. The UK government also introduced the Energy Security Investment Mechanism through the finance bill recently passed at Westminster. That was something called for by the industry, delivered by the UK Conservative government. But it's very clear, and the North Sea Transition Authority says this, that there is a demand still existing for oil and gas from the North Sea. Domestically produced natural gas is almost 4 times cleaner than importing it. The policies of the Labour Party and the SNP would see us importing oil and gas from foreign countries at a higher cost with a greater carbon footprint, and turning their backs on the hard-working, skilled workers in the North Sea.
How do you, though, square the circle of the fact that if you want to reach net zero, you need to start phasing out North Sea oil and gas? Because you're suggesting that there will be hundreds of new licences for oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. It doesn't suggest that you're getting to grips with the other side of that net zero equation.
But that's what I've just said. The North Sea Transition Authority, their own analysis shows that domestically produced natural gas is almost 4 times cleaner than that would be imported under the SNP and Labour plans. We know it is cheaper to produce it here in the North Sea than it is to import it from foreign governments.
What are the Conservatives' plans, though, for the transition to move people into green energies?
Well, that's absolutely vital, and that's one of the risks. If we continue down the route that the SNP and Labour are going, we will see the skilled workers moving away from the North Sea, out of Scotland and the UK, to other countries around the world where there is still exploration, and we don't have their skills to take us on this transfer and this journey to net zero that's going to be so crucial. The UK oil and gas sector is fully behind that transition to net zero, but we can't lose the skills that we have in the North Sea at the moment if we turn off the taps and turn our backs on the sector, which the SNP and Labour are proposing to do.
What are the Conservative government's plans for, or any future Conservative government's plans for that transition? You're saying you'll just keep allowing them to explore for oil and gas. You're not saying how you would actually move the transition faster and more effectively.
Well, that is absolutely part of it. I mean, I was with the Prime Minister just last week up at Nig. That is a yard that is still involved in the oil and gas industry at the moment, but is also developing the renewable technologies that we need for that just transition to net zero. The two work hand in hand, but with the Labour and the SNP policies of turning off the taps and turning their backs on these skilled workers in the North Sea and in the North East, we will lose those skills to other countries around the globe, and they won't be here in Scotland and in the UK to help us with that just transition to net zero.
Are the Conservatives losing the faith of business? More than 120 founders, chief executives in financial services and manufacturing have written a letter. It's published in the Times this morning, backing Labour, endorsing Labour's economic plans.
Well, I'm looking at what businesses are saying here in Scotland, and we're on to speak about the Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce, a representative body of businesses in the north east of Scotland, who are claiming that Labour's policies will put at risk 100,000 jobs here in Scotland. Labour and the SNP have exactly the same policies that will decimate that industry in the north east of Scotland that's so crucial for the whole of our country, not just for the jobs, but for our energy security here in Scotland and across the UK.
And when you widen it out to look at the wider business?
Well, as we've seen, we've had, many fiscal events where the Conservative Party at a UK level have been supporting businesses. If we take, for example...
And many fiscal events where they've caused those fiscal events, I just have to say Liz Truss.
Well, I was just going to say, we've had budgets where we have provided a business rates relief to businesses in hospitality, leisure and tourism. That business rates relief was very welcome in England. The Scottish Government, the SNP, got the money to do that here in Scotland and failed to pass it on 2 years in a row. So here in Scotland, people know that this SNP government and successive SNP governments have not been on the side of business. And in key seats up and down the country, it will be a straight choice at this election for voters to choose between the Scottish Conservatives, who will...
And we've already heard from the SNP this morning, Mr Ross. We've already heard from the SNP, so we don't need you to tell us what their policies might or might not be.
Well,
Let's talk about Rishi Sunak's
the Conservative policy. But I'm sorry if you don't want to hear that, Laura.
It's not that I don't want to hear it. It's just you're mentioning the SNP an awful lot there. Let's talk about another...
just saying the Conservative policy, but happy to move on.
OK, another election pledge from Rishi Sunak this morning, promising to raise the tax-free pension allowance, called the sort of triple lock plus. I wonder how the Prime Minister is thinking about funding this.
Well, that's explained in the document that goes alongside this. I think it's very important that the tax-free allowance will always be higher than the state pension. That is a very clear commitment to those who have worked hard throughout their life, that commitment from a UK Conservative government will be there. It's a welcome announcement. It's positive news, and it's in stark contrast to the SNP here in Scotland, making Scotland the highest tax part of the United Kingdom.
Another indication of the Conservatives really a party for older people, less interested in younger people?
No, absolutely not. This follows on from 2 fiscal events where we've seen national insurance cuts.
Why not just raise the threshold for everyone and do everyone a favour?
A reduction in the tax paid by people up and down the country. It benefits people up to £900 each. That's because the UK Conservative government was able to take those decisions to cut national insurance, and now this policy commitment to support our pensioners is welcome news as well.
Douglas Ross, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Douglas Ross there, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives.